Olney Theatre have begun to educate ourselves about Native American history as it relates to this particular land on which this theater is sat. And it also gives us an opportunity to share that with the community through this land acknowledgement that you see. So I'm just going to read this to you. I know you can read it as well, but I'll read it to you in a second. How many of you are familiar with or have heard of land acknowledgements? About half. Okay, great. That's great. I have to say I was very unfamiliar with land acknowledgements until, for myself, not to center my own experience, but I was in Australia on a work trip in 2012, where land acknowledgements, which are called acknowledgement of country there, are very, very common and have been very common for decades. I was at a production at a theater in Melbourne called the Malthouse Theatre, and we were all milling around this theater lobby, and there were 3 different theaters. They were about to open the shows, and the house manager comes over the loudspeaker, and imagine this in a good Australian accent, and says, "All right, we're seating for in Theater A this, Theater B this, Theater B this," and then the house manager acknowledged the land and song lines of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. I apologize, I tried to practice that correctly. And we offer respect to their elders, past and present. And I just had never, I had never experienced something like that. That was in 2012. A land acknowledgement, I think you can figure it out. They are a centuries-old custom to begin with among Native nations and communities. Today they serve as a powerful reminder of the dispossession experienced by indigenous peoples who formed dynamic and thriving communities in confederacies more than 10,000 years before European colonizers arrived on these shores. And I think why they're important, they force us, they hopefully force you to take a look at the history that you know, question whether that history is actually true at all, and learn whatever the true history is. And for example, for me, I ended up going down this a rabbit hole of education about the Aboriginal peoples, the indigenous peoples of the Australian continent, after hearing that land acknowledgement, and learned quite a bit. I don't know how much you all know about the treatment of First Nations children by the Australian government. Within my lifetime, people born, First Nations children who were being born in Australia were being forcibly taken from their homes so that to basically erase Aboriginal culture and being raised by European families. This was as recently as 1969 when I was alive. So the erasure of indigenous peoples in the West is a very recent memory, and a land acknowledgement is a way to stop that erasure, with at the very least by saying we, all of us need to know our history, and white folks need to learn that history even more than anybody else. So, working with Shruti, Josh Ford, who is our Director of Communications and Marketing, and consulting the Maryland Indian Affairs Bureau, and consulting with folks from the Piscataway tribe, we unveiled this today. So, Olney Theatre is situated on unceded land that is the ancestral home of the Piscataway Kainai tribe. We are grateful for the territory upon which we gather today, and we respect Maryland's indigenous peoples, the original stewards of this land. They are approximately 25,000 self-identified Piscataway tribe members currently living in Maryland. As a nonprofit art institution, we are committed to reflecting the community we serve and creating partnerships with the Piscataway tribe people and urban Indian communities to highlight the continuing contributions of Native artists and create pathways between indigenous peoples and Olney Theatre Center. That's not where we stopped. There is more, which we think is also extremely important. As we honor this history, we also seek to better understand the complex systems of oppression that are integral to the development and history of the Olney area. This includes further necessary research to uncover and address the history of our land ownership, our own land ownership, and conditions of sale that might have involved members of the historic free Black community based in Sandy Spring. And finally, while Olney was a rural area at the founding of the theater, its suburban development, like much of the rest of the country, carries a legacy of racism that excluded people of color from home ownership for many years through discriminatory lending practices by the Federal Housing Authority, the GI Bill, and of course exclusionary land covenants and local developments. As we venture to become a better anti-racist theater, we must seek to rectify the disparities in who we serve so that everyone can feel at home in our spaces. This land acknowledgement, starting Wednesday, is now in all of our programs and will be in all of our programs going forward. It will be on our house boards, our electronic house boards at every theater, not just, of course, during the Thanksgiving play, Beauty and the Beast, you name it, it'll be there. It'll also be always on our website. And as I've said, or hinted at least, this is just the first in a series of steps that we need to take to better understand and learn about what the history was of this very land before Olney Theatre Center was here. And with all of that was far more than Shruti wanted me to say, I bet. But now I'm going to shut up and let Shruti take over. Ladies and gentlemen, Shruti Mukund.
Thank you, Jason, for sharing the history of how this came about and tasking me with making sure we actually executed. So not just me, but everybody, all of us together. And thank you all for coming today to learn more from Rico, Tom, and Natalie, who very kindly shared their thoughts and ideas and things, and I've learned a lot more just having spoken to them, learned about the work that they do, and I'm really excited to share it with all of you, especially in the context of exploring the themes around Thanksgiving, and it makes it really timely for this to be the time to sit down and reflect and see what has happened here on this land. So we gather here today not out of guilt but responsibility, and start the process of decolonization by examining our relationship with the communities where Olney is located and interact with it. To actively acknowledge our privilege and power and openly discuss them, we recognize that as recipients of privilege, we will always be capable of perpetuating systems of oppression from which our privilege came. Privilege in this sense means the privilege of living on lands, not of your own heritage of origin, acquired through processes of historical injustice. The work we do is with integrity and direct communication, guidance and direction from the people we seek to work with, community-led equitable relationships. Today we take that first step to intentionally gather here to present the voices from leaders from the community who directly hold the history of this land. So we welcome Rico Newman, Tom Farquhar, and Natalie Thomas. Their detailed bios are in the program, and to keep in time, I'm going to ask them to share and highlight their personal relationships to this land.
Okay, so thank you, simply. As an elder among the Piscataway, it is an obligation that I have to introduce myself in a traditional manner. I will say words that we like to say might have been some of the first words that Calvert heard when he landed the Olney shores in 1634. And I'll translate it into English, although the words don't translate directly into English, you'll understand what I'm trying to say to you. Welewalahu. Le ko Jose ne winge tape kong o skitawe pano amigo yapio kanahagai. Those words mean, number one, welcome. We welcome everyone to this land. We have always welcomed everyone to this land. Some say that was our first mistake. So, we are still here. And it is good to hear others acknowledge this land and acknowledge the fact that we've been here. And depending on who you read or who you believe, that may range anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 years. We have, within our own rights, we say that we've been here as long as every other animal on this continent. Because we could not have been the only thing that came across the Bering Strait. How did the other animals get here? So that's our take on that. But for this land, the way we acknowledge it is very simple, and I always quote our former chief. He recently left us, unfortunately. His name was Billy Red Wing Tyack. And as Billy would always say, the land is still here, the water is still here, we are still here. I hope.
Did you want to share your history?
My name is Tom Farquhar, and currently I'm farming in the Sandy Spring neighborhood, actually in Ashton. I borrow land from 4 of my neighbors. We manage about 13 acres or so, and I sell at the Olney Farmers Market. You're more than welcome on Sunday morning to come 9 to 1, a bit of a plug. And I actually do 2 farmers markets on Friday. I did one at noon at Friend's house, every Friday at noon at Friend's house retirement community, and at 2 o'clock at Brook Grove retirement community. And at Brook Grove, one of the customers said, "Have you seen the play at Olney Theatre? The Thanksgiving play?" I said, "It's fabulous, you gotta go see it." So I just heard that this afternoon. So, by the way, can we have some better lighting in here? Isn't this a theater? Where's my light? So, my 5th great grandfather was James Brooke, and James Brooke and Deborah Snowden are often thought to be the first couple of European descent who arrived in the Sandy Spring neighborhood with slaves to be in a plantation in 1728. Deborah had 2 sisters who also came within a year to Sandy Spring to settle and to begin plantations. The Snowden girls really are the founders of Sandy Spring. One married James Brooke, one married William Thomas, and another married Philip Thomas. And they came and they started plantations, and within their lifetimes they became extremely wealthy, and each owned upwards of 10,000 to 20,000 acres of Montgomery, what now is Montgomery County, during the 18th century, during the 1700s, during that century after or that half century after they arrived. Growing tobacco. Tobacco destroys the soil wherever it was grown, but it also created immense and rapid wealth among those who held people in bondage. Free labor is an amazing way to accumulate wealth. And people who owned slaves found that to be the case, and that caused great power behind that economic system, great economic power behind that system. There's been I'm a member of the Religious Society of Friends, a member of Sandy Spring Quaker Meeting, and in that community during my lifetime, there's been a story about how important it is that the Quakers freed their slaves 60 or 70 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. What a lovely story. There's a more current story in which we're asking one another, how is it that our ancestors brought people in bondage to this neighborhood to amass considerable wealth? There's an even deeper and more disturbing story, or equally as disturbing story, that I've only learned about in the past year through my work with the Sandy Spring Museum. And that is that the father of the 3 Snowden girls, Richard Snowden Jr., the iron master of what now is Laurel, Maryland, he had an iron forge on the Patuxent River, became very affluent, got huge colonial land grants that he then passed on to his daughters and his sons-in-law. We now know that in 1710 or so, about 20 years before his daughters settled in Sandy Spring, he persuaded the Maryland Assembly to hire a group of 40 men, and they called them Rangers, and they were armed, and their assignment was to clear the Indians out of the Patuxent Valley. Well, that's where we are, is the Patuxent Valley. And the story that my parents and grandparents in the Quaker community told was that mysteriously, when these people of European background arrived in Sandy Springs, there was no one here. The land was available. Of course, the land grants had been given, but there was no conflict with Indians. There were no Indians here. What a rosy picture it was for us to come and to establish tobacco plantations on land that was unoccupied. Well, it wasn't by accident it was unoccupied. It had been cleared by an armed posse, really, of men who had been hired by my 6th great-grandfather to clear the Indians from the land. And then, you know, my 3rd great-grandparents, or 2nd great-grandparents, lived in the Olney, what now is the Olney House, and gave the name of Olney to the village, which previously we know was known as Mechanicsville. So we have deep roots in the area, and if you're looking around for, you know, guilty white wokeness, Jason, come to me. I can do that. I'm getting better and better at that every day.
Thank you, Tom. Natalie?
Yes. Hi, I'm Natalie Thomas, and I'm very happy to be here. I am a native Sandy Spring lady, and my family is from Sandy Spring. So actually, I picked up right where Tom was talking. So one of the, I'm not sure if it's Philip Thomas or whoever had Richard Thomas.
Richard Thomas came along later.
Okay, so Richard Thomas was a Quaker, and he enslaved my ancestors. So my ancestors came along with him and worked on the plantation here in the Sandy Spring area. But in 1806, it was quite a few people through Richard Thomas's will eventually were freed. And that's one of the larger freeing of a whole lot of folks at one time. It was close to 100 people. So those two folks, they were Marjorie and Hazel Hill. And so they, were now free folks, and one of their children was my 4th great-grandfather, Remus Hill, who became a very respected carpenter in the area of Sandy Spring. But what happened was, when the Quakers began to free people as early as maybe 1780s and 90s in this area, that was really significant because many of the black folks, many of them stayed in the area because many of them ended up having some land from the Quakers, maybe able to buy it or maybe it was given, but either way, they had their own plot. Then they became a wage earner for the same people that they were enslaved to, so they began making money. And I think, Tom, you might have shared this quote with me, how one of the non-Quaker white folks said to the Quakers, he said, well, how do you get so much production out of folks? He said, well, I pay them. And that was, so what eventually began was you had these communities, the community started to spring up because you had a group of enslaved people who were now free, and they stayed within the area. They actually started in a place, and they called it Cincinnati. Remus Hill along with Henson Hill, who I believe they were brothers. And Cincinnati would be today where Brinklow is, where the Brinklow Seventh-day Adventist Church is off of New Hampshire Avenue. And so you have a group of folks living there, and then then of course more people just were becoming freed, and this area was known, as my father likes to say, because my parents still live here, and I don't live that far myself, I live in Laytonsville, but it was like an oasis, and that's the way I like to think of it for a black person, because this was a safe haven. It became a safe haven for free people to grow and flourish. So they eventually had a home, and they had a church, the Sharp Street Church is right down the street here, United Methodist Church, 1822. The Stabler family, the Quaker State family of the Stablers, was able to, they gave that land to the church to start. And then schools, and you also had people just able to work. And that was just amazing. And it's something that I'm so proud of because it's very unique. You don't find too many. We're one of the first free black settlements in Maryland. There is another one on the Eastern Shore, actually where Mr. Frederick Douglass is from, in Talbot County, in Easton. It's called the Hill Community, but and it's the same story. The Quakers freed the folks, but here in Sandy Spring, it has just grown, and you had areas. If you look at the map, and it's like a 10-mile radius, you can see the different communities where black folks eventually started other communities right after emancipation. They have worked and had different areas where they live. So that's my connection with this area here in the Sandy Spring community.
Thank you, Natalie. So, Nico, do you want to share with us what's happening here and now as we're learning the history of this area? But you've been actively working on getting like state and federal recognition, and what's happening today.
Well, we started 5 governors ago to try to get the state to extend recognition of our identity. Not because we didn't know who we were, but if you get into Maryland's regulations, the Code of Maryland Regulations, to have access to anything, land, jobs, contracts, subcontracts, you had to meet certain criteria. And state code and regulations said in order, if you identify as native, you had to be either a member of a federally recognized tribe or a state recognized tribe. We weren't either. So up into the 1960s, 1970s, there were very few native people who owned land unless they misidentified themselves. And that is something that lived on to haunt them, because in order to get land, you could not identify as native, so you had to identify as something else. If you were looked a certain way, you could identify yourself as being European, or you could identify yourself as being African American. Then you could buy land. If you said you were Indian, the best you could do was be a sharecropper. Not a lot that's be made from that. Someone mentioned tobacco. To do tobacco, you need a lot of ground because it will exhaust the soil very quickly, and that's a cash crop. We went from a economy that had nothing to do with money. It was based upon raising sufficient amount of food where nobody would experience what you call food insecurity. There wasn't no money, believe me. And the state of Maryland, coming forward, back from that time, I want to bring you forward, fast forward. They denied the natives to have possession of any firearms, which is very strange. All of our neighbors, the Susquehannocks, the Six Nations, they all had firearms. And they preyed upon us because you don't. You know, the big guy's always going to pick on the little guy. The Rangers, as he stated, were supposed to provide the Piscataways with protection. And when I say Piscataways, understand that I'm talking about a plethora of towns with different names, all the way from the town of Piscataway, Tessamata, all the way down to the Patuxent River. There were at least 20 to 26 different major towns along those 2 major rivers, the Potomac River and the Patuxent. They didn't have protection. There's a gentleman that finished a study, can't think of his name, but the name of the book is Thunder Sticks. And he talks exclusively about the availability of firearms to the northern tribes, but none to the Maryland tribes. And this allowed them to prey upon us. And you ask, well, why would they do that? Since we didn't have money, we didn't have silver, we didn't have gold. What we did have was a lot of beavers and a lot of deer. And it was about obtaining those pelts, because then they could be traded to the Europeans with more guns. And they ultimately ran out of their supply of more, so they came down here to get ours, and we were in the way. We were unceremoniously told that for our safety that we need to go into the Zakiah Swamp. And everyone did. I mean, why wouldn't you? You know that these people want to come and take your life, take everything that you have to protect your family and your children. You went to Zakiah. The Rangers were supposed to protect the people. And it's very strange. And you can check this out for yourselves. The Seneca were able to build a fort next to the Piscataways within bowshot. How do you do that if you've got Rangers there that are supposed to be protecting you? So, a lot of things in history, you see the fallacy of what is said is supposed to be done and what actually comes out on the other side of it. From that, everyone says that the Piscataways left. Some did, but if you read Sims, he'll tell you that the majority stayed. Matter of fact, they stayed in the town that my maternal ancestors go back to, and that's Choctaw, down in St. Mary's County. But the Tyree did leave. He went over to Virginia. Virginia didn't want him there. He sent the Rangers over there after they wound up on Edwards Island, ultimately into Pennsylvania, New York, and so on. Many of them ultimately would come back. But you're not going to find that in your history books. You're not going to find that. Only one person had the nerve to research it, do it, and that was Captain Raphael Sims. But we persevered. My father, his father, and his father, my mother's people, all sharecroppers. It wasn't until into the 1900s that part of the family, they were finally able to purchase land. And they were tobacco farmers. And they had to get out of the tobacco business because when they raised their crop and they took it for auction, the prices they got were 1/10 of what the white farmers would get. They couldn't get enough money to sustain themselves, so they had to take outside jobs and they would do sharecropping. And with tobacco exhausting soil as much as it did and rotating your fields, you had to have a sizable amount of land in order to raise another crop, corn or anything else that you could consume. When you start looking at that process, you can see the devastating effect that it would have on Native people trying just barely to survive. Native men were not taught trades between 1700 and the 1800s. Why would they? As she said, they had slaves that they were trained to do these things. Everything from making shoes to sewing suits to making dresses to cooking, you name it. Up until the fact, and I've had some of the biggest arguments of my life when I was at the National Museum of American Indian, that we would have conferences that many of these things are dismissed when you consider that at the end of the slavery period, why were there big problems? Because African men and women had learned trades and become masters at these trades. They were very good at this. And the white yeomen didn't like it. They did not want them coming into Baltimore, New York, Ohio, or anywhere else because they could compete for their jobs. And in many cases, they were better at it than the white yeomen. So anyway, there's a lot of issues that transpire because of that. But coming back to Maryland, people wonder what happened and why did it happen so fast. 1634 to 1700, 66 years. I wish I was 66. That's a short period of time, as many of you know. It goes by that quick. You, your children, your grandchildren, 3 generations in 66 years. Imagine not being around to have or know your great-grandchildren. That is what happened with the Piscataways. In 66 years, by 1700, totally dispossessed of this land. And why? I think you know the answers. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Elder Rico. So, before we open up for questions and answers, I just want to go back to our panelists to ask them, first of all, thank you for sharing all of this wealth of knowledge, but where do we go from here? Like, how do we become good allies? Like, our audience is us, the organization, like, what are the things we can do to amplify voices? What are the, what are the ways we can take this into the future, like, inform our future?
One thing I believe is things like this, having the space and a time to talk and share with people this narrative for people to understand, that there's so much more to the story than what you may have learned or what you may not have learned. But I think that's one thing. And then also just going out and doing something different, experiencing a different festival or a different event. And not just necessarily just going, but also really interacting with the people, who are there to learn as maybe what you can. Even reaching out to other places that you can visit, and just learn more about where you are. I don't think I had said, I'm a volunteer at the Sandy Springs Slave Museum right here on Brook Road. That's a place, for example, people can come visit, you get to learn more about the history of Sandy Spring, but the history about African American history, and the diaspora and how things have been, connected. But that's one of the bigger things is really just have that open mind to sit down and listen. And I would say we have worked with Brook Road, one of our members at the museum. He actually has done quite a few connections with some of the folks there and some like little classes. And it's really been wonderful, because the group has reached out and we are helping, and then, people just get to learn, get to talk about a lot of things, and then people can share with your family. And I think that's one way, well, at least there's many ways I just mentioned, but to at least begin to start understanding a little bit more.
Ignite the curiosity.
I want to talk about the massive economic injustice that is represented in this 350-year history that we're referencing here. And I don't begin to know how we respond to that today, but we need to be constantly aware of it and thinking about that. I have made a proposal, frankly, I'm in a conversation with Sharp Street Church about a gardening project at the farm. And Sharp Street actually approached me. They had tried to do a garden on their church campus, didn't work out, too shady, bad ground, soil, the deer fence didn't work. And but I have a deer fence, and I have good soil, and I have a full day of sunlight. And I was working with the food pantry at Sharp Street. Sharp Street is the oldest African American church in Montgomery County, again, 1822. And so in any case, what we're looking at is a way to have the volunteers who want to be gardening at the members of Sharp Street Church, and who also want to grow food for their own food pantry, where they have a food distribution program every month. And I can be a partner with them. So I made the proposal, and I'm afraid they're going to worry about the proposal because I didn't charge very much. But it was because I wanted to have a relationship with Sharp Street Church, and it wasn't going to cost me much except for my time. And I'm retired, working 6.5 days a week farming. But if another half day was spent in a partnership with Sharp Street to be growing food on this land, where some of their ancestors were brought involuntarily to create wealth for white people, I think about the fact that I was never a great student at Sherwood High School, but I have a grandfather who graduated from Williams College and was a very distinguished teacher and headmaster during his career. Another grandfather who was graduated from Swarthmore and is considered kind of the classic 20th century historian of Montgomery County, Old Homes in History, Montgomery County, Maryland, Roger Parker. These were represent an educational background within the family unavailable to my African American neighbors, which gave me advantages in my career, unavailable to my African American neighbors. So, and we haven't even touched on the economic, injustice to the Native American or Indian population that originally were the stewards of this land. So that's what I'm thinking about. Not an answer.
No, I don't think there's any one solution, and it's not like a snap of the finger and magic. It's all going to fix itself. It's such a complex history, and I think this is just like, we're just scraping the surface today to continue this, and, you know, kind of find different ways, and each of us can make that change. And I think first of all, just even learning about it is the first step, and then, you know, like you were saying, then you start wondering, okay, what is it that I can do, like me, Shruti, or me, you know, kind of thing.
Well, the thing that I want to say, a lot of people have asked me, how did the native people lose that much territory? How did you lose it? Well, we didn't have casinos, so we weren't taking bad bets. Europeans came in with a system called the head right system. And for every person that they brought in, they received a lot of land. The idea was that the people coming over, and at this time it was Europeans that they were bringing over, because England, if you look at the history of England during that period, they wanted those folks out of there. They weren't sending them all to Australia. They were coming here. And for everyone they brought in after a period of servitude, they had an obligation to give that man, not the woman, but the man, 50 acres of land and a hogshead of tobacco to get him a suit of clothes, to get him started. The land that they were given under the head right system is what they were supposed to distribute. But whose land do you think they were giving away to these people they were bringing? Not, they kept theirs. For every person they brought over here, they got 100 or 150 acres, I'm keeping that. I'm gonna give them 50 of yours. And they would turn their hogs and their sheep and their horses loose. What about before we know about fences? We didn't have pastured animals. If we wanted meat, we had to go out and hunt it. We couldn't go out in the yard and hit it in the head. So we didn't know anything about pigs. You know anything about pigs, you better get a fence. And they would destroy the crops. And pretty soon, even down to where my mother's family lived, one guy was given 2,500 acres on one side of that river. And that continued until the last pieces of land, a lot of people know it, Maryland had 6 native reservations. This was way before they started doing reservations out west. Maryland had 6 huge reservations to protect us from this method of this head right system and of these animals coming in and eating up the food. And what do they tell them? Look, you're gonna have to build fences. Why do I have to build fences? You have these animals that are coming in, you build a fence. Well, guess what? Let's see who's gonna starve. They wouldn't build fences to keep the animals in. So the natives would move a little further away. So ultimately, the Latin just said, as the Tayak said, you could no longer justify the actions of the Englishman. And that's why he left and went over to Monaco. But many states, they didn't want to put up with it one way or the other. So it's a drastic system that had the impact that we see today. And we're trying to recover. You know, there was a song out, I think a couple of years ago, that says, come along with me if you want to be happy, you know. It's like being in a house without a roof. Well, that's where we are now. For 50 years, we've been building this house called recognition. And before we even get the roof on it, the government gives us status, and everybody thinks, okay, we got it. We can run with it now. Well, we can't. We still need the roof, folks. So that's pretty much where we are now. We've got a job half done, and we need to do the other half of that job. And that's on us. But we can use help.
You gotta write about this. Really, we need to hear your voice more.